January 1st, 1959. Fidel Castro, just 32 years old, rides into Havana. The streets explode with cheers. People think they've been saved. Cuba had been one of the richest nations in Latin America, but years of Batista's corruption and brutality left the country desperate for change. Castro was young, charismatic, a man who spoke of justice, equality, and opportunity for all. He sold the dream of a fair Cuba, where every child could get an education, every worker could earn a decent living, and every family could share in the nation's prosperity. It was the Cuban dream, and the crowd believed him. But what they didn't know was that they had just traded one dictator for another, and over the next 60 years, Castro would destroy the economy, crush freedoms, and turn Cuba into a place people fled by the millions. Those who escaped built new lives abroad. Those who stayed now stand in 10-hour lines just to buy food.
55-year-old Laudelina Zulueta is returning home empty-handed after spending hours in a queue to buy butter.
Life is a struggle, she says, especially since her daughter migrated to Spain, leaving her to care for her grandchildren on her monthly minimum wage, worth $20 at the black market rate.
So, what happened?
It's a familiar sight in Havana. Disorganized waiting lines in front of supermarkets.
Step back.
The tensions and fatigue are palpable. Cubans are fighting over what little food they can get. It's first come, first serve.
This is the story of how one of the most promising economies in the Western Hemisphere was dismantled by revolution, drained by socialism, and starved by ideology, leading what once was a tropical paradise to become a prison for its own citizens. For centuries, Cuba was a tropical jewel with fertile soil and a prime Caribbean location. After independence from Spain, by way of the US-led 1898 Spanish-American War, Cuba became a booming capitalist economy. By the 1950s, with only about 6.5 million people, Cuba was already the 29th largest economy in the world. Its per capita income was on par with many European countries, roughly 30% of US levels, making Cuba one of the richest nations in Latin America. American tourists flocked to Havana's casinos and beaches, and Havana itself was dubbed a mistress of pleasure, the lush and opulent goddess of delights. In short, Cuba had all the ingredients for prosperity: rich sugar and tobacco lands, growing oil and mineral resources, a literate population, and close ties to the booming US economy. It saw an era of prosperity before 1959. In 1958, Cuba's GDP per capita was about $2,363, higher than Spain or many peers. Living standards were high by regional standards. Cuba had the most doctors per person in Latin America, about 1 per 175 people, compared to 1 per 600 in Britain. There was also abundant food and a rising life expectancy, around 59 years in 1955. Wages were among the highest in the hemisphere, and Havana boasted modern amenities, new Ford cars on the streets, and top-notch hospitals. In terms of modern infrastructure, Cuba pioneered Latin American development. Cities had electricity, radios, and even central air conditioning in hotels before much of the region. But in 1959, everything would change forever. A young and charismatic Fidel Castro and his guerrilla forces ousted Batista with broad popular support. Castro promised democracy and economic justice. He immediately enacted sweeping reforms, raising wages, lowering rents, cutting utility rates, and especially redistributing land. The new government seized tens of thousands of landholdings and most large industries. In March 1959, Castro's government nationalized the telephone company, worth about $9 billion, and soon after took over sugar plantations, oil refineries, banks, hotels, and even small bars around Havana. By the end of 1959, foreign and private ownership of Cuban businesses was almost non-existent. These actions alarmed and canceled Cuba's sugar quota and imposed an economic embargo in 1962. For the first time in modern history, Cuba was largely cut off from U.S. trade. Isolated, Castro turned to the Soviet Union. In 1960, Cuba traded most of its sugar output to the USSR in exchange for oil, machinery, and subsidies. By the late 1960s, the USSR supplied a quarter of Cuba's needs at subsidized prices. This Soviet sugar-for-oil pact initially sustained Cuba's economy when Western sources dried up. Under Soviet guidance, Castro declared Cuba a socialist state in 1961 and adopted central planning. Private businesses were shut down. In 1963, street vendors, small shops, and even family farms became state-run. The government imposed strict price controls and quotas. Factories were told exactly what to produce and at what prices to sell. Wages were flattened. Doctors and taxi drivers earned similarly low salaries. Castro believed Cuba could skip stages and go straight to pure communism, a radical vision with no parallel in the capitalist world. In a tale as old as time, Castro's socialist reforms and tight control of the economy led to economic uncertainty and drastically lowered quality of life. The early 1960s communist revolution began with some popular health and education gains, but economically, it was disastrous. Central planning simply did not work in Cuba. By 1971, Cuban GDP was already smaller than it had been in 1958, while most developing countries were growing. Farm output plummeted. Mechanized sugar fields were mismanaged. With only the state settling production plans, chronic shortages emerged. Factories lacked raw materials, spare parts, and electricity. Transportation became unreliable. Over-regulation strangled the economy. The promise of agrarian reform vanished. In 1963, Cuba's agricultural output fell below 1959 levels, despite a larger workforce. State-run farms were inefficient. Sugar harvests failed. Livestock numbers shrank. As the economy faltered and dissent grew, hundreds of thousands of Cubans fled, often by raft. Perhaps 10% of the population left between the 1960s and 1980s, including much of Cuba's entrepreneurial and professional class. The 1970s saw Castro cement Cuba's dependence on Moscow. In 1972, Cuba joined Comecon, the Soviet economic bloc. Cuba was labeled underdeveloped and given favorable trade deals, most notably selling sugar at inflated prices and buying Soviet oil cheaply. These deals kept Cuba afloat. By the 1980s, nearly 40% of Cuba's foreign trade and two-thirds of its imports came from the Soviet bloc. Soviet rubles kept Cuban hospitals, schools, and factories running. After decades of continuous struggle under Castro, Cubans finally had hope and economic prosperity seemed within reach. But, as we all know, the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. Cuba's entire economic model was built on Moscow's support, and now it has disappeared. The result was the special period in peacetime, a protracted crisis of hunger and deprivation comparable to China's Great Famine under Mao. Between 1990 and 1993, Cuba's GDP got crushed, dropping 33% and leaving Cubans struggling once again. Energy shipments from the USSR stopped almost overnight, so there was no fuel for factories, farms, or power plants. Crops rotted in the fields for lack of fertilizer and transport. Tractors and trucks were left unused. Thousands of stories from the era paint the picture. People stood in lines for food and basic goods. Children's daily caloric intake plunged. According to one study, average Cuban per capita calories fell from around 2,908 in 1989 to 1,863 in 1995, and protein intake dropped 40%. By 1994, the average Cuban had lost about 20 pounds. Malnutrition and vitamin deficiency led to a surge of illness. Over 50,000 cases of neuropathy afflicted citizens, with at least 26,000 developing partial blindness. One U.S. news report called it the clearest indication so far that Cuba's economy has atrophied beyond hardship into crisis. Factories ran only sporadically, often just a few days a week. By one estimate, 90% of Cuban trucks stopped running for lack of oil and parts. To avoid outright collapse, Castro's government grudgingly introduced limited market measures. In 1993, Cuba legalized the US dollar and private small businesses to create a quasi-dual economy. People could now possess dollars and work independently in approved trades. The state floated the Cuban peso and created a special convertible peso, CUC, tied to the dollar. Suddenly, there were dollar stores and upscale restaurants for foreigners, while ordinary Cubans still struggled with outdated pesos and rationing. More importantly, Cuba bet its future on tourism. Massive foreign investment poured into hotels and resorts. Between 1990 and 2000, Cuba spent over $3.5 billion building tourism infrastructure. The number of hotel rooms nearly tripled, from 12,000 to 35,000, and 10 million foreign tourists visited during the 1990s. Tourism overtook sugar as Cuba's top revenue source by the mid-1990s. A two-tier society emerged, those who had access to tourist dollars and those left with meager state wages. Even Fidel Castro lamented in 1992, "We are alone, all alone, here in this ocean of capitalism." The crisis led to despair and social change. Crime and immigration attempts spiked. Some Cubans turned to odd jobs and self-employment, selling homemade food or taxi services despite socialism's prohibitions. A new black market economy began to grow. The gap between Havana's shiny hotels and the dark, impoverished neighborhoods became painfully obvious. The U.S. embargo, which has been in effect since 1960, certainly hurts Cuba by blocking trade and investment. But experts note that embargo effects can explain only a minor portion of Cuba's decline. Cuba's own socialist policies, nationalizations, price controls, lack of private enterprise are far larger factors. As one 2025 study concluded, a counterfactual Cuba without Castro's socialist revolution would today be roughly 50 to 60% richer. In short, it was the revolution's centralized control, not foreign sanctions, that harmed Cuba's economy. And on top of that, brain drain and aging are ever-present problems. The flight of professionals continues. Younger Cubans see few opportunities and increasingly leave for Miami or Europe. Cuba's once youthful population is growing older. The regime's tight grip on speech and dissent also pushes activists and intellectuals out. One analyst notes that authoritarian control, not just economic hardship, defines Cuban life today. Cuba's downfall was not inevitable. Before 1959, it was on a path to become one of Latin America's wealthiest countries. Instead, the communist revolution imposed a socialist economy. While Castro's regime did improve literacy and health coverage, those social gains came at the expense of economic liberty and prosperity. Today, Cuba remains poor by its own past standards. The country limps along on subsidies from allies, tourist dollars, and the sweat of exported professionals. It does not take an anti-communist polemic to see the cause. Decades of central planning and nationalizations have left Cuba much weaker economically than it was under the old pre-revolutionary system. Cuba's story from playground of America to isolated socialist state shows everyone how political ideology can ruin economics. In the end, it was the revolution's own policies that destroyed Cuba's prosperity and condemned generations of Cubans to hardship.